All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our next economics lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about the interaction of supply and demand and kind of what this causes and how this works. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are costs. All right, so kind of looking at what are some costs, what are some examples of costs. Costs are actually made up of a few different things. So costs, we're talking about what suppliers or producers have to pay to kind of produce their product, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about costs. So the first thing that we need to talk about are fixed costs. Fixed costs are costs that are incurred even if no work is being done. Costs that must be paid whether a lot is being produced, little bit is being produced, or nothing is being produced. So this can include things like rent for the business space or the space where the business is taking place, taxes that must be paid to the government, as well as insurance. Whether a producer is producing a lot or a little bit, these costs must be paid, and they are fixed. They're not changing, all right? The other type of costs that we have are variable costs. Variable costs are those costs that vary. They change as input or as output is changing, I should say. All right. And so these include things like labor or utilities, right? Your factors of production. The more you're producing, the more workers you need, the more resources you need. The less you're producing, the fewer workers you need, and the fewer resources you need. So those are your variable costs. They're going to change as output changes. So then to figure out your total costs as a producer, right, as a supplier, you have to add your fixed costs plus your variable costs in order to figure out what one's total costs are. The next thing that we see kind of in this talk, when we're talking about costs and we're talking about suppliers and producers, is what's called the break-even analysis. The break-even analysis is the total output that a business needs to sell in order to cover their total costs. Now, remember that a supplier or a producer or a business, right, they want to make a profit. So they actually want to move beyond this break-even analysis. And this, in order to make a profit, they want to make more than just enough to cover their total costs. They want to make a profit, make more money, right? Which also helps us understand that relationship between production and cost. It helps us understand the law of supply, because producers want to make more. It's all about the profit motive. Okay, so producers have to think about what are their costs, how many workers and how much capital are they going to need in order to produce, and then how do they make enough and how do they use their resources efficiently to cover those costs and make that profit. So this is looking, costs are what we have to talk about in order, as we're talking about the supply side of things. But what we're really interested in today and for the rest of this lecture are prices. Okay, prices involve both our producers and our consumers, our buyers and our sellers, right? Our suppliers and our consumers. And so prices are going to look a little bit different than costs. Prices really convey a message to both the buyers and the sellers. A high price is telling producers, is telling those sellers to make more, right? Because they have that motivation for profit. They want to make that money. So producers make more, supply increases. However, consumers are like, oh, right? They end up wanting to buy less because the price is high. And so this price tells buyers and sellers different things. On the other hand, right, low prices, you're going to tell producers to make less. And so because the falling prices means that there's a possibility of loss. And so you have suppliers pulling out of the market. They're leaving the market. On the other hand, it tells consumers, right, or buyers that now's a good time to buy as the price goes down. And so these prices, as they tell the different stories, though, they do help answer and decide those basic economic questions, right? The prices help producers figure out what are they going to produce, how they're going to produce it, and for whom are they going to produce it. Suppliers have to be conscious of the price as well as the market. They don't want to make something that people aren't going to buy. They don't want to produce something that there's no market for. And so prices really help producers kind of figure this out. All right. Now, in order to really do this, though, prices have to do a couple of things. There's a couple of determinants about prices, really, in order to answer these basic economic questions. First of all, prices must be neutral. Okay. Prices cannot favor the producer or the consumer. They can't heavily favor the producer or the consumer. Okay. In order for that to happen, in order for prices to be neutral, there also has to be competition, right? You can't just have one seller. If there's only one seller, then the price won't be neutral. The price will benefit the seller. So we see prices have to be neutral, but within that, there's an importance, a significance of having competition in order to ensure that those prices remain neutral. There also must be free interaction between the producer and the consumer. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too, but this idea of what's called voluntary exchange. Okay, consumers and producers must be free to interact and must be able to choose to interact. And so we'll talk about that as well. The next thing that we see about prices that's really important is they must be market driven. There cannot be that central command deciding what the price is going to be for different products. All right. So in order for prices to answer those basic economic questions, what, how, and for whom, prices must be market driven. They must be driven by supply and demand. There cannot be that central command or that central government agency or anybody else for that matter deciding the price of a good or service. In addition, prices have to be flexible. All right. Prices, when the market conditions change, prices must be able to change quickly in response. Okay. So prices have to be allowed to adjust, to be flexible. Buyers and sellers are going to adjust their behavior based on the price. And so prices, in order to answer those three basic economic questions, prices have to be able to adjust accordingly. And this also really helps the market change, right? If you think about the cost of computers 15 years ago to what they are now, with more and more and more people have computers because the prices have gone down and because they've become so important. All right. On the other hand, if you look at CDs, right, something that I personally used a lot of back when I was your age, those aren't even available anymore, I don't think, right? And so the price has also dropped, but the demand has dropped as well. And so prices have to be flexible in order to adjust to the market. Okay, and then finally we talk about prices have to be efficient. All right, the prices are going to adjust until the maximum number of goods or services are sold. All right. And so this allows producers to kind of sell their goods and services in order to make a profit. But prices, because prices are flexible, they're also able to be adjusted to reach that efficiency where you can sell the maximum number of goods or services in order to meet the needs of the supplier. So these are the things that must happen in order for prices to answer those basic economic questions. But what we see happen out in the real life market is this adjustment of prices. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. In order for prices to adjust, in order for them to kind of figure out what is going to make people happy, there has to be compromise. All right. Buyers and sellers have conflicting goals, right? The sellers or the producers, they want to make money. And so those sellers, they want high prices because they want to make as much profit as possible. Sellers, on the other hand, are the consumers. They want to save money. And so they want prices to be low. So because of this, there has to be an opportunity for prices to adjust, and for buyers and sellers have to compromise in order to kind of meet a happy place. Now, this is going to happen through the adjustment of, when this happens, this adjustment of prices, both sides are going to benefit, right? So you have a producer who's going to kind of start with a price, and if he or she or they can sell, then they're going to be able to meet in the middle with what works for the consumers. When there's adjustment of prices, this is what I was talking about before, when you have a consumer and a seller who voluntarily enter into an exchange, The producer's not being forced to produce a particular good or service. The buyer isn't being forced to buy a particular good or service. They are voluntarily, by their own will, entering into this agreement. Then both buyers and sellers agree to participate, and both sides end up benefiting. As I said, producers will start to experiment with prices, and as the interaction of supply and demand happens, the price will eventually settle. Remember what happened when I asked you to enter into my grain market, right? The Shaw grain market. You maybe wanted to sell your grain at a certain price, but you may not have been able to. And so you had to compromise. You had to adjust. If you were really being stubborn and demanding, no, I'm going to buy at this price or I'm going to sell at this price, you were unwilling to compromise. You struggled more than your classmates who were going through deals really, really quickly as they were willing to compromise in order to meet the needs of the market. Not just their own needs, right? The needs of the market. As that happens, as buyers and sellers agree and meet that kind of happy place, that's what's called market equilibrium, okay? So prices will move toward this where quantity supplied and quantity demanded is equal. This is also where prices are going to be stable, right? Because this is that happy place where buyers and sellers are happy, where the quantity demanded at a price is equal to the quantity supplied at that price. The supplier is willing to produce that many particular items, and the buyers are willing to buy that many particular items at that particular price, and everybody's happy. Equilibrium. Now, there's a couple of times where, things don't really work out. And as prices adjust, we have two different things that we need to talk about. Number one is a surplus. A surplus is where there's extra, okay? An extra is, we're talking about the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, right? The producers are producing more than the people actually want. And if that's the case, when there's a surplus, when we have a true market situation here, right, the prices will fall, which means there's going to be an increase in demand because prices are going down and a decrease in supply. And what we'll see here is a surplus will be temporary only as long as those prices are flexible in order to adjust to meet in order to adjust to the fact that there's a surplus, that there's an extra supply. The opposite of surplus is a shortage, right? This is where the quantity demanded is greater, the demand is greater than the quantity supplied at any given price. This will signal that prices are too low, right? And so this will then lower the demand because the price is going to start to increase, and increase the supply because the price will increase in order to adjust for that shortage. And ultimately, we see that consumer demand is not being met by the existing suppliers. So we'll see more suppliers coming in, or we'll see other changes in order to get back to that equilibrium. And again, this is only temporary as long as those prices are flexible, as long as there's no outside force adjusting the prices. Speaking of outside force, oftentimes we have that government involvement. The government can be involved in a couple of different ways, but ultimately the impact of government involvement is that it removes the flexibility of those prices. All right, one way that they can do this is through rationing. With rationing, that market price is no longer able to change when the market changes. Right? That's ultimately what the government involvement is doing when they remove that flexibility. So rationing is where the government will limit how much consumers can buy, how much either goods or how many services the consumers can purchase, which will create an artificial shortage, not an actual shortage, but an artificial one. Now, a lot of times this rationing is done in response to an actual shortage, but it just makes sure that there's enough for everyone. So some examples of that, we have historical examples are rationing during World War II, where you needed your ration book to prove that you were still allowed to buy these products in addition to the cash in order to pay for them. In the 1970s, there were a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, which created a gas shortage, a gasoline shortage. And so gas you could only buy on certain days based on your license plate numbers. And this was, again, the government being involved in rationing, limiting the supply that consumers were allowed to purchase. And until that ration is removed by the government, it will create an artificial shortage. The other way that we see the government removing the flexibility of prices are through a couple of things, are through what are called fixed prices. One example of that is a price ceiling. And this is where a price can't go any higher, right? It's the ceiling of the price. The price cannot go up any higher. It's the highest price that can be charged. An example of this is rent control. This is going to be set by cities or counties. And this is saying you cannot make people pay above this rent, right? That's it. It's going to be capped. And so that's a price ceiling. All right. It creates an artificial shortage. On the other hand, opposite of a price ceiling, we have a price floor, where the government says the price cannot go lower than this. An example of a price floor is minimum wage, right? And so the government has established a federal minimum wage, and then states establish their state minimum wages. But ultimately what that means is if you live in California, for your work, you must be paid at least a certain amount per hour, right? And honestly, I don't know what it is right now, but you can look it up and figure it out. It's, I believe, still in the $10, but like San Jose, they moved to $15 an hour. I believe San Francisco moved to $15 an hour. So if you live or work in those cities, you have to be paid at least $15 an hour. That's the floor. You can be paid more than that, right? But at least $15 an hour. And so this is another way that we see the government being involved in the way that prices are done, and it does not allow for those flexibility of prices in the same way. Now, sometimes we don't have market equilibrium. There can be changes in market equilibrium, and when the market's out of whack, right, we call this disequilibrium. And so disequilibrium is an imbalance in the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. It can be caused by changes in demand, and if the price can't quite adjust, we're going to be in disequilibrium. Same thing, it can be caused by changes in quantity supplied, or the changes, right, caused by changes in supply, which cause a shift in the supply curve. Change in the demand, a shift in the demand curve. And so until the prices can readjust, we're in this time of disequilibrium. What ultimately you need to understand about this is that this idea of equilibrium is a moving target. As economic conditions change, so does the equilibrium price. When equilibrium price changes, this is then going to impact the quantity produced or the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, which can then again shift the curves and change the price again. So market equilibrium becomes this moving target that producers and sellers, that buyers and sellers, that supply and demand are constantly trying to find that happy point where suppliers and consumers are happy with the price and are willing to pay, consumers are willing to pay this much and producers are willing to produce at that price, and it's moving all the time based on economic conditions. So I hope that you were able to learn a little bit more about that interaction of supply and demand. Thank you so much for listening. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I hope you have a great day.